Rain tapped steadily against the tall windows of the penthouse office, a soothing rhythm muffled by layers of glass and distance. In the corner of the sleek space, a stack of untouched takeout sat cooling next to a glowing monitor, a testament to hours lost inside spreadsheets and conference calls. Ethan Vale adjusted the cuff of his shirt as he leaned forward at his desk, the soft hum of city life below reminding him that the world was moving on without him. Again, it was nearly 8 o'clock. His son would be asleep by now if the babysitter had shown up. He checked his phone. No messages from Mrs. Landry, the woman who usually stayed with Theo. She'd been his quiet savior since the divorce, reliable in the way very little else in his life had been. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Vale, your new temp is here. Should I send her in?" Miranda's voice, his assistant, was always clipped, businesslike, even after 5 years of managing his schedule. Ethan blinked. "My what?" "She's from the agency. Mrs. Landry had an emergency, this one's filling in. The agency said they sent her resume." He hadn't seen it, he barely had time to breathe, much less read resumes for childcare. He nodded toward the intercom as if Miranda could see him. "Fine, send her in." He expected a middle-aged woman with thick glasses and a notebook. Instead, the door opened, and in walked someone who didn't look like she belonged in his world at all. She was younger than he'd imagined, early 30s maybe, with a calm presence and wind-dampened curls tucked into a navy coat. She took her time removing it, revealing a cream sweater and worn jeans, the kind with the fading that came from real life, not design. No clipboard, no frantic energy, just a steady gaze that met his with quiet confidence. "I'm Nora from Kindred Hearts Agency," she said. Her voice was low even, not soft exactly, grounded. "You're the babysitter," he said, rising out of habit more than warmth. "I prefer childcare specialist, but sure." She didn't flinch. "Theo's 5, right?" "6 in December." He crossed his arms, studying her. "You've read his file." "I don't need a file to know he likes dinosaurs, prefers grilled cheese without crusts, and gets anxious when people raise their voices." He stiffened. "How?" "Mrs. Landry filled me in," she said, then paused. "And kids that age don't hide much when you listen." He was silent, not because he agreed, but because she'd said it so plainly. "You'll be staying at the house?" he asked. "If that's what's needed." He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He didn't let people into his personal space easily. But Theo had taken the divorce hard, and the revolving door of stand-ins and rushed pickups hadn't helped. He needed consistency, even if it came from a woman who dressed like she'd walked out of a Vermont bookstore instead of a midtown building. "You'll report to Mrs. Landry when she returns," he said. "Understood." She looked around his office once, then back at him. "Do you want me to take Theo to school tomorrow, or will your driver?" He hesitated. "My driver." She nodded, already adjusting to his pace. "Then I'll have breakfast ready by 7, pancakes or eggs." He blinked. "Does it matter?" Her lips tugged at the corners, almost a smile. "It always matters to kids." And with that, she left. Theo took to her faster than Ethan liked. Not that he wanted his son to stay guarded, but there was something unsettling about how easily Nora fit into the spaces Ethan had worked so hard to keep controlled. By the end of the first week, she'd rearranged the kitchen so Theo could reach the cereal without climbing. She'd set up a routine with visual cards stuck to the fridge, something about transitions and emotional regulation. When Ethan walked in after back-to-back meetings, exhausted and irritable, there would be music humming low and dinner already halfway done. Not fancy, but warm, intentional. One night he came home late again. His tie was loose, his inbox still full, and his patience stretched thin. Nora was sitting on the floor of the living room with Theo, their backs to him. They were drawing on a giant sheet of butcher paper that spilled over the edges of the rug. "This is a volcano world," Theo explained, pointing at a chaotic swirl of red and black. "And what's this part?" she asked, her voice low and steady. "That's the safe cave. That's where the baby dinosaurs hide when it gets too hot." Ethan felt something shift, not in the room but inside him. Something tight gave way. Later, after Theo was in bed, he found her in the kitchen. She was rinsing brushes from their painting session, sleeves pushed to her elbows, a quiet focus to her movements. "You're good with him," Ethan said. She didn't turn. "He's a good kid." "You're not what I expected." "Is that a problem?" He didn't answer right away. "No, just an observation." She finally looked up, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "You're not what I expected either." "How so?" "I figured a CEO dad would be colder, more detached, but you show up in all the small ways, you keep trying." That disarmed him more than he liked to admit. He cleared his throat. "I'm not home enough." "You're home more than you think. Kids don't count hours the way we do. They count presence." He didn't respond. He wasn't sure he knew how. By the second week, the house felt different. Not just because of her, but because of the absence of what used to linger. The silence had been heavy since his ex-wife left, more than the quiet of rooms, but a hollowness in the rhythms. Nora didn't fill it with noise. She filled it with meaning. Music, small routines, the scent of soup warming late on a Thursday night. She didn't ask for attention, didn't comment on the stack of business awards on his shelf or the newspaper clipping where Forbes had called him the reluctant visionary. She moved through the space like she'd been invited, not just hired. Ethan began coming home earlier. He told himself it was for Theo, but the lie grew thin. One evening, as he set his briefcase down, he noticed the piano was open. "You play?" he asked. Nora looked up from the kitchen table. "A little." "Has Theo?" "Only once. He's curious but unsure." He used to watch his mother play. His voice dipped low, a memory he didn't usually touch. "She taught him the difference between minor and major keys," he added after a pause. She studied him a moment. "That's a lovely thing to remember." He nodded, the quiet between them stretching but not uncomfortable. That night when she thought he'd gone to bed, he heard her playing, a slow melody, familiar but not showy. It filled the house in a way that made it feel like a home again. He didn't know what to do with that. By week 3, she was more than the babysitter. He just hadn't admitted it yet. Monday morning came with the scent of cinnamon and a quiet hum of Nora singing under her breath as she poured batter into a pan. Ethan stood at the edge of the kitchen, out of sight, watching her. She moved like she belonged, not with entitlement but with familiarity, like someone who had studied the rhythm of the house and slowly built her own beat within it. Theo sat at the table still in pajamas, knees tucked under his chin as he colored a cardboard cutout of a stegosaurus. He didn't look up when Ethan stepped into view, but Nora did. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a second mug. Ethan hesitated. He usually took his on the way out in a to-go cup, scalding hot and tasteless. But he nodded, and she poured it without another word, setting it down next to a small plate with a halved pancake shaped vaguely like a brontosaurus. "You made this?" he asked, sitting slowly. Theo grinned. "She says if you eat your favorite dinosaur, you get extra strength." "It's science," Nora said dryly, wiping her hands on a towel. Ethan tried not to smile. He hadn't eaten breakfast at the table in months, maybe longer. The days folded into each other, stitched by small details. A scarf Nora left draped over the arm of the couch, the way she sang when she folded laundry, Theo's sudden shift into laughter instead of anxiety when something didn't go his way. Ethan had never hired someone who affected the air of a place before. It unsettled him. One Thursday, Theo came down with a fever. Ethan was in a meeting when the call came through. By the time he rushed home, Nora had already spoken to the pediatrician, picked up medicine, and set up a pillow fort in the living room where Theo slept under a blanket shaped like a dragon. "He's okay," she told Ethan softly at the door, her hair in a braid, face calm despite the circles under her eyes. "Just needs rest." "I should have been here," Ethan said, guilt threading through his chest. "You came, that counts." He sat beside the pillow fort for a long time that evening, one hand resting gently on his son's back, feeling the warmth of his skin. Nora didn't hover. She returned to the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes grounding the quiet. Later, after Theo was asleep in his own bed, Ethan walked into the kitchen where she was finishing a cup of tea. "You didn't have to do all that," he said. "I know. You stayed calm." It's part of the job. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. That was more than a job. She didn't deny it. He watched her for a long beat. What did you do before this? She looked at her tea as if it held the answer. I worked in early childhood development, had my own little place. Then my dad got sick and I moved back to take care of him. After he passed, I didn't really want to go back to running programs. I wanted something slower, smaller. This is smaller, he asked, half smiling. Her eyes softened. This is real. By mid-October, Ethan realized he no longer needed reminders to get home. He wanted to be there. His calendar, once booked to the minute, had unexpected gaps, ones Miranda noticed but didn't comment on. Anything I should be aware of? She asked one morning, eyeing his blocked-out evenings. Ethan didn't look up from his tablet, just clearing space. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That Friday, Ethan came home earlier than usual and found Nora in the sunroom, curled on the window bench with a worn paperback in her hands. She didn't notice him at first, lost in whatever world she was reading, legs folded beneath her. He watched her for a moment, then stepped into the room. She looked up and smiled, brushing a curl from her face. "Quiet afternoon?" he asked. "He's with your sister. She took him to the aquarium." He sat opposite her, the late light casting long shadows across the room. "You could have taken the time off," he said. She tilted her head, and missed the chance to read in a quiet house with a cup of tea. Not a chance. He smiled, then frowned slightly. "You don't take much time for yourself." She closed the book, resting it on her lap. "This feels like time for myself." He looked at her, really looked. She wasn't polished in the way the women he used to date were, no sleek blowouts or designer labels, but there was something undeniably beautiful about her. The kind of beauty you didn't notice at first, but once you did, it didn't let go. "Why did you really take this job?" he asked. Her eyes met his without flinching, because it felt like the right place to land for a while. "And now, I'm still landing." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand anything, and then she stood, slow and graceful. "Dinner?" she asked, breaking the moment gently. He nodded. The first snow came unexpectedly, dusting the sidewalks with white and frosting the edges of the windows. Theo shrieked with delight, tugging on Ethan's sleeve, begging to go outside. "Let me finish this call." Nora appeared with 2 mugs of hot chocolate and a pair of mittens. "I've got him," she said simply. Ethan watched from the window as they built a crooked snowman in the yard, Theo's laughter bouncing off the cold. Nora crouched beside him, showing him how to pack the snow tighter. She wasn't just filling time, she was present in it. That night, after Theo had fallen asleep with pink cheeks and damp curls, Ethan brought out a bottle of wine. He hesitated for a moment, then found her on the back patio, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the stars. "May I?" he asked, lifting the bottle. She looked surprised but nodded. He poured them each a glass. They sat in the quiet, breath visible in the cold. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Miss what?" "Whatever life you had before this." She didn't answer right away. "Sometimes I miss things I didn't appreciate back then. Noise, clutter, friends who didn't need explanations, but I don't miss who I was." "Who were you?" "Someone who kept moving to avoid stillness." He nodded slowly. "I know that person." She turned to him, her face lit by the dim porch light. "And who are you now?" "I don't know yet." Her eyes didn't waver. "That's honest." They drank in silence again. The air between them felt different, not charged exactly, but aware. He didn't want the evening to end, and he didn't know what that meant. Later that week, he heard Theo crying in the middle of the night. Ethan was out of bed before he realized he'd moved. But when he reached the hallway, he saw Nora was already there, kneeling by Theo's bed, smoothing a hand over his head. "It was a bad dream," she whispered, "but you're safe, I'm here." Ethan stood in the doorway unseen. He should have stepped in, should have taken over, but Theo clung to her hand like it was an anchor. "I'll stay until you're asleep," she murmured. And she did. Ethan didn't sleep that night. Something in him had shifted, and he couldn't shift it back. It was Saturday when the first real crack appeared, not in the routine, but in the illusion that Ethan had control over it. He had promised Theo the whole day, no phone calls, no meetings, just them. But an early morning emergency at the office dragged him away. It was supposed to take an hour, then two. By the time he stepped back into the house, it was nearly dusk. The living room lights were off. The house was too quiet. He found them in the backyard, beneath a makeshift tent of blankets and fairy lights. Nora and Theo curled into each other like they had their own world, untouched by his absence. Nora saw him first. She didn't move. Neither did the disappointment in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. Theo didn't answer. His head was tucked under Nora's arm, eyes fixed on the small flashlight that cast shapes on the inside of the tent. He was quiet in a way that wasn't natural for him. Ethan crouched at the entrance. "I got stuck, I know," I said. "You always say," Theo muttered. Nora didn't interrupt. Ethan exhaled. "Can I come in?" Theo shrugged and Nora lifted the blanket slightly. He crawled inside, not knowing what he was supposed to fix. They lay there in silence for a while, all three of them listening to the soft wind in the trees and the occasional distant car. It felt like stepping into someone else's dream, where the rules were different and no one was in charge. "I used to build forts with my dad," Ethan said softly. "He always pretended the floor was lava. We had to hop on pillows to survive." Theo didn't say anything, but he shifted slightly closer. Nora looked at Ethan and didn't smile, but her expression softened. She saw the apology in his eyes, the effort, the wish to rewind time. "You can't keep promising pieces of yourself you don't have," she said once Theo was asleep. He met her eyes. "You think I don't know that?" "I think you forget." The next morning, Ethan cooked breakfast for the first time since maybe ever. He burned the first round of eggs, undercooked the pancakes, and set off the smoke alarm, but when Nora walked in, she didn't laugh. She took the spatula from his hand and wordlessly showed him how to flip the next one with a gentler wrist. "I don't know how you do all of it," he said. "I don't do all of it," she said. "I do what I can." "But you make it look effortless." "It's not," she said quietly. "It's just worth it." He looked at her, really looked. The way her hair was still damp from a shower, her sleeves rolled, her expression unreadable but present. She never deflected. She stood in whatever moment was handed to her and faced it. He wasn't sure he'd ever met anyone who did that. Later that week, Ethan's ex-wife showed up unannounced. She stood on the front porch in sunglasses and heels too high for the sidewalk, her coat too thin for the November chill. "I was in town," she said. "Thought I'd stop by." Nora answered the door. Ethan was upstairs. There was a long moment where the two women studied each other. "Are you the nanny?" the woman asked. "I look after Theo," Nora replied, keeping her tone even. The woman gave a tight smile. "That's what I used to do, before I remembered I had a life of my own." Ethan came down the stairs, tension already tightening his jaw. "Maya," he said. "I thought I'd take Theo for the afternoon," she said breezily, stepping inside. He hesitated. "You should have called." "Do I need an appointment to see my son now?" Nora stepped back, giving them space, but Ethan caught the flicker of something in her eyes, protectiveness maybe. She didn't hover, but she didn't disappear either. Theo came running into the hallway, then stopped short. "Mom." Maya crouched and opened her arms. "There's my big man." He walked to her slowly, less sure than he'd once been. Ethan didn't interfere. He let the moment play out. Maya took him for the afternoon. Nora didn't ask any questions, but when Ethan returned from the kitchen, she was sitting on the stairs, hands clasped. "She left, didn't she?" she asked without looking up. Ethan sat beside her, 3 years ago. "She still comes back. Sometimes, when she's trying to feel like she made the right choice." "And does she?" "I don't know," he said, "but I stopped waiting for her to." They sat in silence, shoulder to shoulder, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. That night when Theo was back in bed, quieter than usual, Ethan found Nora outside. She was standing on the deck in her coat, arms wrapped around herself, watching the dark yard as if it held answers. She used to come in and out like a storm, Ethan said, back when it still hurt. Nora didn't respond. Her breath came out in small clouds. She told me once that she couldn't be the kind of mother who stayed still. And you? I couldn't be the kind of father who left. She looked at him, her face unreadable. You love him well, she said. I want to love him better. Nora nodded almost to herself. You're learning. He stepped closer. So are you. She didn't flinch, but she didn't move either. The days grew colder, the routines deeper. One evening, Ethan found himself sitting with Theo at the dining table, gluing googly eyes onto a construction paper monster while Nora cooked. He caught her watching them from the kitchen, her gaze lingering just a second too long. She looked away when she saw him notice. Later that night, he stood in the hallway outside her room. Her door was cracked open. She was sitting on the bed, brushing her hair. He knocked lightly. She turned. Everything okay? He stepped inside. The room still looked temporary, her suitcase half unpacked, books stacked on the nightstand. But her presence was woven into the air now, undeniable. I need to ask you something, he said. Okay. Why haven't you left yet? She set down the brush. Do you want me to? He shook his head. No, that's not what I meant. Then ask the real question. He looked at her, heart unsteady in his chest. Why are you still here? She studied him. Because this matters. And me. Her voice was barely a whisper. I haven't figured that part out yet. He didn't press, he just nodded. But something between them had changed. And they both knew it. The first snow that stuck blanketed the city by morning, muffling everything into a quiet hush. Ethan stood by the window in the living room, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands, watching as Theo stomped boot prints into the untouched white of the backyard. Nora was out there too, tugging on a too big scarf Theo had wrapped around her neck like a cape. She laughed when he fell backward into a snow angel, then crouched to help him up, brushing snow from his coat without saying a word. She didn't need to. Her presence was its own kind of language now. Ethan wasn't sure when exactly it had happened, when she stopped being the babysitter and became something else. Something he hadn't let himself want in years. He had built his life to be efficient, predictable. There were rules, compartmentalization, calendars synced to the second. Nora had disrupted all of it with her quiet steadiness, with her soup and routines and the way she saw through people like glass. He knew what this looked like, and he was starting to understand what it felt like. But knowing wasn't the same as doing something about it. Nora started keeping her suitcase zipped. She noticed it without meaning to. One morning she reached for a sweater and had to unzip the whole bag to get it. That hadn't been true before. She used to let things spill out, to tuck socks into drawers and stack books on the windowsill like she planned to stay. But somewhere between the unexpected closeness and the look in Ethan's eyes that night in her room, she'd started packing in her sleep. It wasn't fear, it was protection. Nora had stayed too long once before, after her father died, clinging to what was familiar until the grief turned sour. She learned that even quiet spaces could echo eventually. She hadn't expected to stay in this house for more than a few weeks, but now the days were stitched together with too much meaning. And that was dangerous. She was sitting on the edge of the guest bed folding Theo's favorite blanket when Ethan knocked and stepped inside. Hey, he said, softer than usual. Everything okay? He nodded, leaning against the doorframe. You're quieter lately. She looked down. So are you. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. Do you ever think about what happens after? He didn't pretend not to understand. After what? After this, after I leave. The words landed harder than she meant them to. Ethan crossed the room slowly. You think you're going to leave? She hesitated. It's not my life, Ethan, it's yours and Theo's. I was always meant to be temporary. That's not how it feels. But that's what it is. Her voice was steady. You're building a life for him. I was just here to keep it steady for a while. You've done more than that. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes with tired truths. That's the problem. The holidays brought more reminders of how temporary things could feel. Ethan's company hosted their winter gala, and Miranda insisted he make an appearance. You haven't been to a single function this quarter, she said, standing in his office with a clipboard and a tone that left no room for argument. He sighed, I'll go just for an hour. That night he stood in front of his closet longer than he should have, staring at rows of suits that all looked the same. Nora passed by, slowing when she saw him. Need help. He looked over his shoulder. You know anything about cufflinks? I know they're mostly decorative. He stepped aside and let her in. She moved through his closet like she'd done it before, brushing her fingers past a few options before pulling out a deep charcoal jacket and crisp shirt. This one, she said, less stiff. Thanks, he said, then added, will you be here when I get back? She looked up, surprised. Where else would I be? He wanted to say with me, but not at a gala, not under chandeliers and small talk and performance. He wanted her in the space that felt real here, among the quiet places where feelings were built, not declared. He left without saying more. At the gala, he stood in a room full of people who knew his name, his earnings, his legacy, but not his story. He shook hands, gave short answers, smiled when required. And then his phone buzzed. A photo from Nora. Theo asleep on the couch, surrounded by crumpled wrapping paper and toy dinosaurs. Underneath, he wanted to wait up for you, didn't make it. Ethan stared at the image for a long time before excusing himself and leaving the event early. When he walked in the front door, the house was quiet except for the soft flicker of candlelight. Nora was curled up with a book, half asleep on the couch, one arm still resting across the back like she'd meant to keep watch. He didn't speak, just watched her for a minute. Then she opened her eyes. You came back early, she said, her voice rough with sleep. I missed home. The word hung between them. She sat up slowly. I brought you something, he said. He pulled a small box from his coat pocket. Inside was a simple bracelet, silver, with a tiny charm in the shape of a fern leaf. I saw it on the way out of the gala, he said. It reminded me of you. She didn't touch it because it's quiet. Because it's resilient. She swallowed hard. Ethan. I know, he said, it's complicated, but that doesn't make it untrue. She looked down at the bracelet, then back up at him. I didn't expect you, she said finally, not just tonight, all of it. I didn't expect you either, he said, but I see you, and I don't want to go back to before. The space between them narrowed, but no one moved first. It wasn't time yet. A week later, Theo had his winter recital. He stood on a small stage in the gym of his school, face pale under the two bright lights, clutching his kazoo like a lifeline. Ethan arrived just in time, slipping into the back row, coat still on. Nora was already there. She turned to him, smiling. No makeup, no fanfare, just presence. Afterward, when Theo ran to them, they knelt together to hear his rushed recap. Nora wiped a smudge of frosting from his cheek. Ethan adjusted his scarf. It wasn't a family portrait, but it was close. They walked to the car slowly, Theo skipping ahead, dragging his backpack. You could stay, Ethan said, his voice low. Nora didn't answer. But she didn't say no. 2 nights before Christmas, Nora stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Ethan fix a lopsided tree ornament. Theo was asleep upstairs, the house filled with the glow of string lights and pine. She walked over and stood beside him. I unpacked my suitcase, she said. Ethan turned to her, startled. You did. I figured it was time. And then, without ceremony or permission, she rested her head lightly against his shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a pale blue sky and the hush of a city half asleep. Snow gathered along window panes, softening the edges of everything, even the noise. Inside the Vale house, the scent of cinnamon rolls wove through the rooms, thick with warmth, grounding them in a slower rhythm. Theo sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by half-wrapped gifts and a growing pile of discarded tape. He hummed to himself, the kind of sound only children made when they felt entirely safe. Across from him, Nora leaned over the coffee table, tying a ribbon around a book Theo had picked for Ethan. It was a beginner's guide to paleontology. "He says you need to catch up," she said when Ethan appeared in the doorway. Ethan smiled. He's not wrong. He stepped into the room, barefoot, holding two mugs. He handed one to Nora, her fingers brushing his in a quiet, familiar motion that no longer made him pause. "Are you still on board for tomorrow?" he asked her, watching Theo carefully fold a drawing and tuck it into an envelope labeled Dad. Nora took a sip. "You mean dinner with your sister and a crowd of people who will want to know everything about the woman living in your house." He raised a brow. "I meant that part where we're pretending to know how to roast a turkey." Oh, her eyes sparkled. "Then definitely no." They both laughed softly. But there was something else in Ethan's expression, something that hadn't been there even a week ago. A steadiness, not confidence but certainty. He reached for the envelope in Theo's hands. "Can I see?" Theo shook his head. "Not until tomorrow." Ethan ruffled his hair. "Fair enough." He looked over at Nora. "Can I show you something?" She nodded. He led her down the hallway, past his office, into the room he hadn't opened for anyone else since the divorce. It had been Theo's nursery once, then storage, then nothing. But now the walls were freshly painted in soft, calming colors. A small bookshelf stood by the window, a desk, a couch. Light filtered through linen curtains that hadn't been there a month ago. Nora stepped in slowly, taking it in. "What is this?" "A room," he said. "For whatever you need, it's yours if you want it." She turned, startled. He ran a hand along the doorframe. "You've been living here but never settling. I see you trying not to leave a mark." She looked down, her voice quieter. "I didn't want to overstay." He stepped closer. "You never did." She let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Are you sure?" He didn't rush his answer. "I've spent years building a life with no room for anyone else," he said. "And then you came in, and everything changed, not because you demanded space, but because you made space feel like something I wanted again." She looked up, eyes brimming with something quiet and vast. He took her hand. "Stay, not just in the house, with us." Her fingers curled around his, not hesitant but careful. "I wasn't planning on falling into this." "Neither was I." "But I did," she said. "Me too." They didn't kiss, they didn't need to. The moment wasn't made for grand declarations, it was made for choices, and she made hers. The next morning, Theo burst into their bedroom at 6:30, pajama feet thumping on the hardwood. "Presents," he shouted, launching himself between them. Nora let out a muffled oof and buried her head in the pillow. Ethan groaned, dragging an arm across his eyes. Theo bounced. "You said 7. "It's 6:30, Ethan mumbled. "7:30, Theo insisted. They gave in. Downstairs the tree glowed softly. They took their time. Theo tore through his gifts with joyful chaos. Nora opened a small box from Ethan. Inside was a simple key, no note, just that. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. She slipped it into her palm like it had always been meant to be there. Later, after the mess and the laughter and the breakfast pancakes in the shape of T-Rexes, Nora slipped upstairs to change. Ethan found her in the hallway, staring at the room he had given her. The door was half open. The light was on. "Still want it?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I already do." He stepped beside her. "You know Theo thinks you're magic." She smiled, looking toward the sound of him laughing downstairs. "He's not wrong." Ethan turned to her. "You fixed more than just our schedule, Nora." "I wasn't trying to. That's the part that got me." She looked at him then, long and full and whole, and for the first time since she'd stepped into that house, her eyes didn't carry a trace of the door she thought she might someday need to walk out of. She wasn't in between anymore. She was home,